So I think one more minute, Amy, and we can
Cool.
get underway.
Excellent.
Okay, Amy, do you want to get
Yes.
us underway? So,
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the New Zealand component of the International IACD live streaming session, wherever you're joining from. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you. And I will be presenting on behalf of members of our community, including individual contributors, parents, whānau, and individuals who are working within the space known as moving to adulthood. Just as a quick housekeeping, thank you for joining. And if this is being recorded as part of the 24-hour live stream, so please, if you do not wish for your face to be shown, please keep your camera off. Our talk today will be consisting of an overview of the ideas of what it means to move from the pediatric system into adulthood within the context of Aotearoa New Zealand, some of the practical considerations that our families and members have talked to us about, have conveyed and shared during the last years of health system reform, and some practical insights into day-to-day tips and tricks. This will broadly be broken up into a couple of sections looking at the overall trends, experiences of young people and families, clinical perspectives, practical pathways, and discussion. Now, first, I thought it was useful to really admit that the process of leaving pediatrics and moving into adulthood can be a fraught and very hard thing to navigate and understand, even in the best circumstances. And in a practical sense, we are dealing with it's good that this is a global live stream on this topic because we're very much dealing with a global system and a global series of issues and challenges that very much overshadow and underpin the process of moving between pediatrics into adulthood. And a note on definition. This process was customarily called transition, which aside from having a very specific use in other communities, I've often found to be a challenging definition because it implies moving from one state to another. And in a very real sense, I think the idea of moving from a child into adult services is a whole series of movement changes and adaptations, not a singular step from one to the other. There are ongoing processes and ongoing discharging elements. And nobody I've spoken to has been able to come up with a better term or a different way to phrase it, but in a real sense, it is being discharged from one set of circumstances into a rather unknown landscape. And there's no singular way to do it or how to do it. And a lot of the people, in particular, the young people with childhood onset disabilities that I've spoken to, spoke to me about the surprises of this process, the ideas around the privacy laws, for example, and the ability to have to handle their own information or no longer have a system within which their parents can easily make sense of how to be part of the advocacy process and wanting to connect and convey that one thing that would be really useful for clinicians to be able to do is stop the element of surprise that just how different the adult services are from the pediatrics. And and in conveying that, there's also a very nuanced sense of what adolescence and adulthood actually means, because a lot of the families that I speak to and engage with repeatedly talk about that their children have a different sense of adulthood and a different way of approaching adulthood in terms of how they define and are able to define their child's experience of being an adult. And there is a sense of what does it mean to be independent when you are physically dependent in a lot of senses. And a particular contributor George Boland, is a member of our wider community, asked me to convey the idea of not only is your body changing and you're getting the endochromatic storm that is going through puberty and becoming a young adult, but your sense of disability is also changing, because how your disability, whatever the disability happens to be, is very much connected to your body's underlying biological conditions. So the ability to understand your disability often changes along with the institutions that you are leaving. And in the way in which our families conveyed the idea of moving to adulthood, there were two components, because not only do the young people and their young people experience a change, but their families also experience the change of navigating how they experience and engage with the systems that they can no longer be a part of in a very practical sense, but they also expand in their who and what they are engaging in. And so we would all like the system to be different, and we would all like for the idea that self-advocacy isn't the most vital tool when it comes to moving to adult services, but it very much still is. Like, and whether this be self-advocacy for the individual or the self-advocacy for the wider whānau family unit is the thing that still very much is, as one of the families like to say, it's very much the oil that gets the car going, in the sense of if the self-advocacy component isn't there, then there isn't movement within the system. Although, to be fair, within an Aotearoa New Zealand context, there is a lot of movement and a lot of push towards making systemic change, because what we believe is that the inability to resource moving to adult services is very much a wider symptom of the public health system difficulties and challenges. And so, in a sense, what our families were talking about is the idea of how can their medical allies, either in the pediatric system or moving into the adult system, support a realistic understanding of what actually is going to happen. Our National Hospital Starship has some nice resources on the changing of why pediatrics and adult services look quite as different as they do, and the advocating alongside families to make a sense of change. And this is just some work that a colleague and I did as part of a clinical education day, of like some of the questions that can go into the interaction of living with CP. And this is for a pediatric context, but I think very much some of the questions can be useful in a adolescent or moving to adulthood perspective as well. And one of the things that families asked me to talk about today was the idea of what happens when communication breaks down. So you have a point of contact, but you feel like that they aren't listening and they aren't hearing you, or they've moved on, or and it's nowhere near as organized as it was in the pediatric setting. So some of the ways in which people asked us to talk about was the idea of assigning roles and building consistent messaging and responsive when it comes to the common questions around adolescence and this big thing we call adulthood. And understanding a sense of responsibility around, yes, there should be a whole system and it should be better resourced, but currently it's not particularly well resourced. And so with people are in the process of helping to support building self-advocacy tools and toolkits, creating support networks so that the families, the families in particular primary caregivers, aren't the only ones who are taking on 100% of the responsibility all the time, because the reality is that's not sustainable, particularly for parents who are aging. And the idea of preparing for adolescence at different points and for different levels of intensity at different times. Identify the system changes that need to be advocated for. There's a lot of advocacy in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and abroad, looking at the broader issues of not systemically resourcing people with childhood onset disabilities, and again, transition in its older form is a symptom of the not resourcing the system. But so there's multiple levels of making sense of the the advocacy process, advocating for individuals, whānau, and the wider community. And this is a a step process that a couple of our families have talked about in terms of how to build a more comprehensive picture of what we mean by moving to adult services, because we don't just mean who's going to sign the medical notes. They very much come to us asking about all the different elements of the timing and the sheer logistics of navigating a new system. And the earlier we can gently start these conversations, the easier it is to frame the situation. And the parents that I've been working with asked me to share with you an idea of what she would hope that they could get from a moving to adult services kind of system. So she asked for the engagement to be continuous, coordinated, and compassionate in the sense of all the different levels of need and requirements for both the individual and the family, but also addressing the idea of complex needs, and that adolescence, again, aside from being a physiological storm, can be a storm for the disability. And I added the last C just because I love onomatopoeia and patterns, but there needs to be a certain level of courage for people to take on. Yes, the being a clinician in this space is incredibly hard work, and people are under resourced, but somebody needs to continue to make continued effort to ask for change in whatever level you are. There can be allies for the transition, well, the moving to adult services. Sorry, I keep saying transition just because I ally have it, but I'll come up with a better word. And then we can make a difference at whatever level we are, either as community groups, clinicians, parents, or eventually government. And this is a photo essay that one of our families offered for me to share, talking about the different elements of the change process for them and their son, particularly around, if you'll note in the top photos, around the different changes and challenges, because not only is the individual going through the change of moving between services, but often the parents are doing the same thing as well. Parental illness can be in play as well. And I just thought that the middle image on the top was particularly striking, looking at the effort to help a young person sustain and sustain posture. And I thought that was very emblematic of the transition, the moving between adult services, because it takes a lot to get it done and a lot of different things to make life into a comprehensive picture. So these are just some overall reflections and discussion questions that came out of the conversations I had. And I thought these could be a good way to prompt sort of discussion and talk, because that's what we're hoping for with the last of the session, but also as you move on into other sessions and can make and maybe bring them into future discussions, because no one person is going to say, oh yes, I got the formula for this. But if we can all start knocking over dominoes, there can be a positive upward spiral rather than a downward spiral. Uh, and so, just for closing my part of the talk, the adulthood pathways are challenging, but they are navigable with the right kind of support. Family, young people, and clinicians all have different puzzle pieces they can put together. Together, they can be sustainable energy to make change. Moving to adulthood is really hard. It's really, really challenging, but it doesn't need to be impossible. And thank you. Special shout out to George, Kimberly, Sarah, and all the other community members that helped me put together this presentation. I'm presenting on behalf of their work and essentially their plea that we can make systemic changes wherever we are. Thank you. Ooh.
Thank you, Amy, for those amazing slides to share with us all. And there's a lot of
Oh,
food for thought. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think what we thought now is Amy has got those questions that she presented, but actually, if people have thoughts around their experience moving to adulthood services or otherwise experience from a clinician's lens or health professional lens, please put your hand up and we'd really like to start the discussions because we're leading the world in this. I said to Amy, we're first off the block, so that's always exciting. So we get to set the standard. And I might start with somebody. I might start with Jimmy. Hello, Dr. Jimmy. Would you like to share some of your experience working with families in terms of when you start the conversations around moving on to different services and how you've found that experience?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And thanks very much, Amy, for that fantastic presentation and insights. I think it sets the scene really well in terms of transition or moving to the adult system is often it's often feared in terms of what the unknown is, and we don't need to fear it. And first of all, it's having those open conversations about what the differences would be between pediatric services and adult services. Let's recognize, first of all, that that's quite artificial, and it's how our health system is set up. Whereas what we need to do is bring that back to the needs of the young person and at what stage of development they are. So I think that's first of all going to that point in terms of when does it start. I think it depends, and it's very personalized on a individual by individual basis. But we should be open to having those conversations early, and across different services. Sometimes that starts as young as 12. I think in terms of other things to bear in mind is some of the practical issues. So, for example, what happens when a child or a young person turns 16 in terms of consent wise? The day-to-day stuff about who holds personal information and consent. And then the other side of things is how we actually set up our clinical conversations instead of being directed at the child or about the child. we should be framing it and really drawing that in terms of who is leading this conversation. So I think the points that I'd like to make are we can prepare for this. There are some practical tools out there, and I know Marcus in particular has done a lot of work in the group around this. How do we support and assist young people in terms of making decisions and taking charge of their care? And when we set up our conversations with adult services providers, how can we get the most out of it from a young person's and family's perspective?
Thank you. I took away from that, don't fear it. I think that's a really good thing. It's not a scary thing if we can all go with that. Marcus, your name was mentioned, so you're next from your experience in the education field. What would you like to share?
Sure. So Jimmy mentioned the work that the Transition, it was called Transition, still is, group did for the Cerebral Palsy Clinical Network before it was absorbed into the Neurodevelopmental Clinical Network. And we did a very low budget sort of systematic review of what was, what models existed in terms of transition and what research told us was our best practice guidelines. And we can find all of that stuff within the Starship website, what was produced. And from a education point of view, so I mean, one thing to be aware of, regardless of transition or not, is that there is always somewhat of a regional lottery or even clinician lottery when it comes to who you end up with and who your coordinator is going to be and where you're going to be. So from my perspective, and locally here in Rotorua, I typically would try and start transition around that 14 mark. Jimmy mentioned as early as 12, and certainly that was what was recommended as best practice in the research. However, 14 tends to work very, very nicely with kids having spent a year settling into high school, and now they're kind of starting to think about what am I going to be picking for my NCAs and things like that, and actually looking at that kind of future career planning, depending on the child. And so, so I quite like 14 as a good time to start. And around that point, I also like to reframe the IEP model, so the individual education plan, to start getting a bit more focus onto things like an individual career plan, like an ICP, or even an individual occupational plan, an IOP. I invented both those things, but because all you got to do is add a couple of letters in there. But yeah, just starting to look forward to what are we going to do after school, and one of the things that we came across when we were doing our group work was the Ready Steady Go model out of the UK, which was developed for kidney kids. And it's fantastic. I utilize that quite a lot. We have some other models that exist, like the Surrey Place questionnaire is equally as comprehensive. I like the look of the Ready Steady Go model a little bit more and can push that towards parents and say, well, why don't we actually try and do this questionnaire right now and see where all of our gaps are? Because that way we've got the next 4 or 5 years to start working on these gaps. And I mean, there is so much more that we need to talk about in relation to this, but I don't want to monopolize all the time here. So I might let somebody else have a talk, and we can come back with more specific questions later. Because otherwise, I'll go on for 45 minutes.
Thank you, Marcus. Amy, I was just wondering, and maybe some other people from CP Society who are here, do you have resources within your organisation, as Jimmy mentioned as well, around preparing families around privacy laws and confidentiality and understanding those different concepts that come in when you become an adult? Are those the sorts of things that you do share with families?
Well, we have to do a bit of a conversation around that through our work within the community because we're bound by the same privacy laws. So we try and keep a note of when our members turn 18 or are close to turning 18, that start having those conversations with their primary contact and their families early and just gently start introducing the idea because it can be quite a confronting notion for people. We're not saying that we can't talk to them. It just needs to be talked through and discussed of like who who is going to be talking with and for the child and soon to be young adult if they need to be. Because as I mentioned in my talk, one of the things that's difficult is that people's sense of parenting is different when it comes to children with complex needs and overall global developmental delays as they may be constructed. So it's what we don't really have a formal process, but we have to have conversations with parents and guardians as this type of thing comes up. And the way we do it is just to ask people how they have, what kind of conversations they've had in the past, what they best want from us in terms of like the people who will continue the talks for their children or with their children. Often in an ideal scenario, parents would like to introduce more people into their child's life because they recognize that they can't sustain the level of care indefinitely. If only parents and primary caregivers could be immortal, right? But it's it's very much about who will be the next nominated person.
Thanks, Amy. Gayla, do you want to, before you have to go to the Australian session, share from your experiences on both sides of the Tasman, what you've been finding?
I suppose I sort of wanted to open up about what were the things that helped people move into adulthood. You know, it's such a terrible saying and we need to stop saying it, but who, you know, from the families you've talked to, Marcus and Jimmy and Amy, who had some key tips about maintaining community contacts. I think I'm really interested in about, you know, we know that in the hospital space that some of those contacts decrease and that's part of the systems in place, but about providing that social connection and that community sense. I wondered if people had a sort of an idea of what's the best things to help with that, because I know when young people leave school, often those things go, and all of those things that were organized, like, you know, sporting practices and drama group and all those things that they did at school all of a sudden go. So I wondered if people wanted to talk about what is the best facilitators to help people maintain that community contact.
I think that's a really good point, Gayla, because the first thing that often comes to mind is health transition, but we're actually talking about a whole lot of different things in terms of stages, both from a getting older perspective is one thing, aging, and going through changes, but also the day-to-day and what that looks like. Look, I think where families have felt more comfortable is when they have a structure or a plan around that in terms of how they're going to be able to manage things and what a typical day and week will look like. I think it's also Amy touched upon the word courage. I think that's really key because it's different from if we take it from a wider perspective. It's not just about their diagnosis or background. It's what this young person has been through and what's got them up into this stage and who are their key people. And so integrating wider around some of the models of childhood disability that we understand. So, for example, the F words, and that's a good conversation starter. I think it's also useful in conversations if verbal communication is not the most effective way. Thinking about making sure we have enough time for those conversations to take place. What is your 3 sentences to describe yourself as a young person that you think would be really important to know? And then the other aspect as well is who do we now consider within our team? And a lot of this defaults to the family themselves and their GP, but then that's very different to how we've done this for the last how many or so years. And it's about proactively looking into that. So rather than seeing this as an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff analogy or a band-aid where we go to people with problems, I think it's now focused more on well-being and keeping you well and healthy. And that links in with community groups and making those connections going forward.
Absolutely. Jumping on top of that, so here in New Zealand, we have wonderful groups like Parafed and Halberg and things like that. So in terms of people who you can liaise with and find out about activities that are being run and stuff like that for sporting and wonderful things, like our Parafed throughout the country, they flick an email out every week saying, this week, this is what we got on, and you're welcome to join us, So joining those sorts of things, and all of our other societies like CP Society, who can let you know what's going on. You can start meeting some of those people who will keep you engaged. And obviously earlier on, if you are super into a sport, well, join the club. You don't have to be a part of the school one. So that way when school ends, it's not all over. And I mean, I'm a big exponent of encouraging the child to find or to foster a love for exercise going forward. And what that means effectively is we want them to be motivated to keep doing it forever. So they have this nice positive relationship that keeps them fit and healthy and doing all these wonderful things, right? So that's one thing. And of course, we do have some other advocacy services that exist out there as well, along the lines of CCS Disability Action and stuff like that, who are generally pretty whole of life. One of the things that when I was doing our health transitions in Rotorua, I had a nice big list of, these are all your whole of life people, your orthotic service and your seating service and this service and this service. That person is not going to change, and they're going to likely be very nice people who will help coordinate you in the community and things like that. And you can always come back and ask me anyway, because I'll still answer emails on the phone, and spending time talking to the GP and getting to know your GP, so that way you don't feel weird all of a sudden just switching to the GP and stuff like that. So those sort of those key people, forming relationships with them early really helps in that transition period as well.
And I think it's really important to start breaking, as Jimmy said, breaking down the artificial distinctions between pediatrics, adolescent, adulthood, as if they're like these concrete stages. Never, like, you never look back on pediatrics, we never look forward to adulthood. It's very much a lifespan approach. And I think the more we can break down those silos, the more constructive it'll be, and the more we can hope for what I sort of term like a minimum viable product. So even if there is a postcode lottery or a clinician lottery, at least there can be some level of foundation that the conversations happen. So that, and particularly because New Zealand has such a strong, increasingly strong Indigenous health models and things, and different senses of what community means, the more we can socialize these ideas, and the more we can lead with a strength-based approach. And even if it's not a strength-based approach, we can aim for a not terrifying approach, right? Like the most common metaphor that our family talk to me about is you feel like you're falling off a cliff. A bit like the lemmings that fall off the cliffs in those nature documentaries, which by the way was completely artificial, and the poor animals don't do that in the wild. But that's by the way. But I would like for us to be able to, that rather than falling off a cliff, our families feel like they can paraglide off a cliff and they can ride the currents rather than feeling like they're hurling towards the ground, because we're never going to be able to make it easy, but maybe we can just make it a little less like people are alone. Does anybody have any opinion on what wasn't helpful? Like a lot, because a lot of stuff is bandied about when it comes to adult health and adolescent health. Was there stuff that wasn't helpful in your experiences? Like, like an example, when I was talking to some families, they were saying that like having a singular conversation about this wasn't helpful at all. Like they felt like they needed multiple conversations. And I think that's a good place to start with any of this work, is saying, look, this is something that's a slow evolving process, not a in-depth. It's a comprehensive thing that will take a whole lot of new skills to learn. But you can.
I think it goes hand in hand with improving access and removing
Yeah.
some of those barriers. So we think about how appointments generally in the health system, if I spoke about that specifically, are set up. You know, what sort of barriers are there in terms of booking appointments, being limited in terms of time. Transport is another one, and then being able to be in a setting where you can actually utilize technology and resources. So the way around that is often services might not have that perspective of thinking about things, and reaching out ahead of time is I think helpful. Um, the other aspect is considering support people, um, and as part of that handover, it's thinking which support people within your wider group, which includes your school therapists or people within your community group that can help with, first of all, preparing for those key milestones or appointments, and also attending potentially as well. Navigating both the health system, but physically, getting to those appointments and making sure you get there on time.
Good. So things that I've identified over the years as not being useful or practical. I mean, so from the research that we did, one of the things that came in relatively strongly was that that transition from children to adults happened really, really well when there was someone who was passionate about it, when there was somebody who took on the role of transition coordinator and ran with it. And then, of course, once that person left, the whole thing stopped working. And so I guess having the entire system reliant on people with passion, and rather than having a beautiful system that is systematically set up nicely to make this work, then that's obviously not that useful or practical. And to the extreme of that, I've heard of people transitioning with no conversation, no nothing. It just one day they weren't invited to go to that section of the hospital anymore or to see that group of people anymore. And so at the very least, please have a policy around how transition should go. And at the very least, please at least have some kind of handout that indicates where do you go once you've stopped with these people. I sort of will bring it back to, I think it's great, obviously, if we start a lot sooner. There's wonderfulness if we can have this nice crossover between our different clinicians, and if you can get a handover going with them, and ideally actually having the child being a part of that. So you have these sort of joint sessions with two clinicians and you get a chance to really explain who this child you've been looking after is, and ideally they get to explain it for themselves, and there's this nice crossover so we can build relationships and things like that. But yeah, the things that aren't particularly practical is the person who says, oh, that's not really my job and I don't have time for it. That's certainly not particularly useful.
And in your experience, as people have seen this for a number of years, has this started to improve? Like, are you seeing less of those extreme examples of like just fire out the door kind of thing?
It's hard to say. Sometimes I meet people who are 22 and they tell me about their transition, but that was only last week, right? And they got nothing. So, so that's a really recent example in my head, but technically it happened a little while ago, you know what I mean? And obviously I know the examples of the kids that I've been looking after. And I'm not perfect, and sometimes we want to be able to give them this wonderful transition, but find that there isn't an equivalent service, which can always be another challenge and barrier to us providing good transition. But as you both have said, everything is actually navigatable, really. It is doable, and we don't really need to fear it. We just need to be able to find these places and things. So yeah, it can be tricky, but I do think we can actually achieve it, especially if we start early and try to identify those barriers early that we're going to need to jump over.
And I think it's worth noting too that even though it's ideal to start early, starting any time is also useful too. Like it's never too late to start making connections and introducing people like with services that they may not know about as well. And I think that's where community groups can really play a role in connecting people that may not have had the most ideal traditional experiences in what we call transition or did call transition. Still haven't got my head around the switch. Um, does anybody else want to say or chime in with anything?
I was going to talk to Warood, but she might be doing this while she's in transit because she's been doing a number of working with adults with disabilities, but it might not be a good time for her to communicate, unfortunately. Don't know, Amy, is there any other points you want to add before we finish up? I know there's the other session I think has just started in Australia.
Yes.
And so I put the link there for others, for the other sessions for you guys to have a look at to see where the next sessions are.
Yes, where your next stop in the world is going to be.
Yeah.
And just a reminder, the whole sessions are all being recorded and will be on the IACD website if you'd like to engage with some other professionals and other groups that are doing some really good work all over the world. And thank you so much for attending, and special shout out to Jimmy and Marcus for agreeing to come along and listen to me ramble. And thanks to the families that contributed to my presentation. And thank you so much. And good luck on your next adventure. Stop around the world and have a good weekend.
Thank you, Amy.
Mm.
I'll stop recording.